Okay, hi everyone. We're going to be moving on to chapter 5 today. Last time we looked at chapter 4, which was the murder of Sir Danvers Carew, and we analysed the extreme violence and the kind of subhuman qualities that Hyde was displaying out in the street, and that was witnessed by the maid. The start of chapter 5 is essentially straight after chapter 4, there's no gap between them, maybe about a day or two, but nothing more than that. If you recall, Utterson has already identified the body of Sir Danvers Carew, so he goes to speak to Jekyll at the start of chapter 5. He goes to speak to Jekyll because he knows at the end of chapter 4 that it was Hyde that committed the murder, and he wants to speak to him about the connection with Jekyll. What's interesting is where this chapter initially takes place. It's the first time Utterson is in Jekyll's laboratory. And there's a really good quotation at the start on page 19, which reads, "He eyed the dingy, windowless structure with curiosity and gazed round with a distasteful sense of strangeness." So there's some elements here which are related directly to Hyde, this immediate sense of strangeness and disgust, which is linked to the lab. That's important because the lab is where Hyde is created. Another key thing is the symbol of the fact that it's windowless. No one can see in, it's secretive, it's locked as well, you need a key to get in. So there's a lot of these symbols that repeat themselves throughout the novella. We've talked about before the idea of locked doors or closed cabinets. Well, this windowless laboratory is a really important symbolic place as well, the setting. What happens is we have Utterson speak to Jekyll about the murder of Danvers Carew, and it's clear that Jekyll is shook up by this murder. The main reason being is because he knows that he committed the murder as Mr. Hyde. Utterson doesn't know this yet, obviously. The quotation in the bottom of the page is really important. Jekyll held out a cold hand and bade him welcome in a changed voice. So it becomes quite clear that Jekyll has been changed by his experience as Hyde. It seems like Jekyll is so probably guilty about what he's done as Hyde that he's sickened to the core by what he's been capable of doing. And then we have this affirmation from Jekyll that he is done with Hyde. He repeats himself over and over. "I swear to God, I will never set eyes on him again. I am done with him in this world." So there's this element of secrecy because he's keeping a secret still that he is Hyde, but he's trying to be honest in that he's going to completely disassociate himself from Hyde. The fact that he swears to God is important as well. He's pulling on religion as a little bit of a crutch almost to support himself through these challenging times. He also repeats a strange phrase at the bottom of page 19. He is safe, he is quite safe. It's almost ironic. Why should we care that a murderer is safe? But what he means by that is that he will no longer harm anyone else. He is gone. And he seems to be able to say this with such authority. We eventually find out because he is Hyde, so he can say that. Moving on to the next part of the chapter, it's important to recognise that Jekyll seems to really affirm his disassociation from Hyde. A key quote about a third of the way down page 20, "I cannot say that I care what becomes of Hyde. I am quite done with him." Another repetition of this affirmation. He is no longer associated with Hyde at all. It almost seems like Jekyll is telling himself this. Yes, he's speaking to Utterson, but he seems to be repeating almost a mantra, a saying to himself, to try and teach himself a lesson that he cannot continue with this relationship with Hyde. He then continues by referencing his own sense of confidence. Near the bottom of page 20, he says, "I have lost confidence in myself." It's a little bit of honesty from Jekyll, highlighting perhaps that he knows he can no longer control Hyde, so he's trying to again disconnect himself from him. Moving on to the next page, this is where Utterson leaves the house. He speaks to Poole, the butler, and Poole says a letter wasn't handed in, which sparks Utterson's curiosity. Utterson goes home with the letter, and he happens to be in his home by the fire drinking some wine with his clerk, Mr. Guest. He's basically a guy that works for Utterson. Now he asks Mr. Guest his opinion on the letter, and he asks him to read it because apparently Mr. Guest is very good at kind of reading people's handwriting to try and figure out what they're like. Now this was actually a practice that was quite common in Victorian era called graphology, and it was criminal graphology was this idea that if you read someone's handwriting you could understand their character and try and decide whether or not they were evil or had bad intentions. It's not really trusted in today's kind of criminal practice. No one really believes that you can analyse someone's personality really through their handwriting, but criminal graphology was quite popular in the Victorian era. And one thing that a guest notices is that it's actually very similar handwriting to Dr. Jekyll's, and he compares Mr. Hyde's handwriting with Jekyll's, and he notices something, a really good quote here near the end of this chapter. The two hands are in many points identical, only differently sloped. So one goes this way and one goes the other. Now, this might be a little point by Stevenson to suggest that the two men, Jekyll and Hyde, are almost identical in who they are, but one leans towards being good, Jekyll, and one leans towards being evil, and that would be Hyde. So through the handwriting, which again, this criminal graphology, we get a sense of the leaning towards each side. But the thing is, Utterson still doesn't really think, obviously, oh, it's the same person, because that would be way beyond his recognition of what could happen. Instead, the final quote really in the whole chapter, he believes Henry Jekyll forged for a murderer. So he believes that Jekyll forges Hyde's handwriting, probably to try and protect Hyde, to let him get away. That's what he believes, which is still pretty shocking, but nowhere near as shocking as the idea of them being both the same person. Those are all probably the most important quotes, in my opinion, for chapter 5. Hopefully it helps you understand the chapter. It can be a little bit confusing just with the handwriting and who's going where. But it's a really good chapter to get a sense of this duality between the two men. Next week, we're moving on to chapter 6, Remarkable Incident of Dr. Lanyon. Thanks.